The recent kinetic escalation targeting Iran's petrochemical infrastructure is being framed by mainstream news outlets as a precision strike or a strategic setback for the Tehran regime. This analysis, however, is fundamentally flawed, suffering from a chronic inability to process the mechanics of power beyond the immediate tactical horizon. It focuses on the explosion, the plumes of black smoke, and the immediate industrial loss. It fails entirely to account for the systemic shift that such an attack forces upon the geopolitical landscape. When you systematically dismantle a nation's capacity to refine and export its own natural resources, you do not force a capitulation. You force a radical and potentially uncontrollable shift in that nation's survival calculus. The reality that the headlines obscure is simple. Iran is not a state that relies on the stability of global markets to survive. It is a state that has spent 4 decades optimizing its existence for sanctions, isolation, and economic warfare. By targeting the petrochemical heartland, the operational logic being applied by the West is a 20th century playbook for a 21st century conflict. They are playing a game of attrition against an adversary that views attrition as a state of being. The mathematical reality of this war is simple. When you destroy the production capabilities of a regime that is already sanctioned out of the global market, you are not destroying its economy. You are accelerating its transition into a wartime command structure. Let us analyze the structural geography. The petrochemical plants in question are not merely industrial sites. They are the nodes of a decentralized survival network. For decades, Iran has operated on the principle of resistance economics. This is not a choice. It is a defensive posture. By hitting these targets, the attacking force assumes that economic distress will translate into political instability. This is a fundamental misunderstanding of the regime's internal pressure valves. When the external pressure becomes existential, the regime does not fold. It internalizes the conflict. It shifts the burden of the economic collapse onto the population, consolidates the military command over resource distribution, and eliminates any remaining room for domestic dissent. The strike that was intended to weaken the regime, in effect, serves to harden its shell. This is the inversion of the conflict. The attacking power, with its high-cost, high-tech assets, is attempting to force a capitulation through the destruction of infrastructure, but they are operating against a geography and a culture that has institutionalized survival. The asymmetry here is not in the technology, it is in the objectives. The United States and its regional proxies are fighting for the preservation of a status quo that is already disintegrating. A world of predictable energy prices and stable trade routes. Iran, however, is fighting to finalize the destruction of that very same status quo. They view the loss of these facilities not as an end, but as a catalyst. Consider the second-order effects that the media consistently fails to aggregate. When the output from these petrochemical hubs is suppressed, the immediate reaction is not a global market correction. It is a tightening of the regional energy supply chain, leading to a rise in global crude prices. The media treats this as a market hiccup, a temporary volatility. In reality, it is a strategic tax levied on the global consumer. Every dollar added to the price of oil by this escalation is not a loss for Tehran. It is an indirect global subsidy for their survival. The revenue loss from the specific facility is dwarfed by the revenue gain from the global price increase that the disruption itself triggers. The logic is relentless. The more unstable the region becomes, the higher the energy prices rise, and the higher the revenue for non-aligned producers who are not subject to the same sanctions architecture. We are witnessing the systematic creation of a shadow economy, one that operates parallel to, and often at the expense of, the Western financial system. This is not a bug in the global system. It is a feature of the transition into a multipolar reality, where energy becomes a weapon of mass economic disruption. Furthermore, we must address the geographic constraints. The Persian Gulf is a confined space. It is a pressure cooker. When you strike deep into Iranian territory, you are not engaging in a limited action. You are engaging in a process that demands a response. Tehran's response will not be a mirror image of the attack. It will be, as always, asymmetric. They will not attempt to match the air power or the naval tonnage of their opponents. They will look for the choke points. They will look for the nodes where the global economic architecture is most vulnerable to low-cost interference. A single mine, a single cyber attack on a regional port, a single disruption of a data node. These are not military actions in the sense of the Westphalian state. They are surgical strikes against the predictability that Western economies require to function. The Western strategic community continues to operate under the assumption that they can calibrate this conflict. They believe that by increasing the pain on Iran, they can modulate the behavior of the regime. This is a policy of blind acceleration. By pushing the regime to its absolute limit, the architects of this campaign are effectively removing the regime's capacity to do anything other than act with maximum radicalism. They have stripped away the pragmatic factions of the regime, leaving only the hardliners who view the conflict through the lens of pure survival. They have made the cost of surrender higher than the cost of war. In any strategic conflict, when you present your opponent with the option of total defeat or total war, you should not be surprised when they choose the latter. This is where the geography becomes destiny. There is no route out of this conflict that does not involve significant disruption to the global flow of capital and energy. The structural reality is that the Middle East is no longer a region that can be managed by external security guarantees. The old world, where the US could dictate the rules of engagement, is over. We are currently in a transition period where the old systems are still functioning, but they are hollowed out. They are fragile. They are waiting for the next shock. And the strike on the petrochemical heartland is exactly the kind of shock that reveals the brittleness of the entire architecture. The complexity of the global system, often hailed as a strength, is now its greatest vulnerability. Because every part of the system is interconnected, a disruption in one minor hub triggers a cascade of adjustments that are difficult to control, difficult to predict, and even more difficult to reverse. The Western powers are attempting to navigate a maze while the maze itself is being set on fire. They are using the tools of global integration, sanctions, financial blockades, market pressures to force a result that would only be possible if the global system were fundamentally stable. It is not. We have to understand that the global system is a fragile consensus built on the belief that everyone will play by the same set of economic rules. Iran, by its very nature and its geopolitical position, is challenging the premise of that consensus. It is not asking for a seat at the table. It is arguing that the table is built on a lie. When you treat the international economic order as a weapon, you cannot complain when others start treating it as a target. The strike on the petrochemical heartland is a tactical manifestation of a deeper structural war. It is a war of attrition, where the victor is not the one with the most sophisticated missiles, but the one who can endure the longest period of systemic instability. As these events unfold, the disconnect between official statements from Washington and the reality on the ground will continue to widen. The official statements emphasize stability, deterrence, and partnership. The reality on the ground emphasizes extraction, hedging, and survival. This gap between narrative and reality is the primary indicator that the system is unraveling. The longer the trajectory continues, the more expensive the final adjustment will be. We are not merely watching a conflict. We are watching the transition into an era where the cost of maintaining the status quo is greater than the cost of letting it collapse. The petrochemical heartland is just the beginning. As the system stresses under the weight of these disruptions, the next phase will involve the weaponization of the maritime corridors themselves and the subsequent withdrawal of insurance and logistics providers from the region. This is the inevitable path of a conflict that has no off-ramp. The focus on petrochemical assets, hubs of production and refinement, is not merely a military decision. It is an ideological assault on the concept of modern industrial capacity. By systematically targeting the very infrastructure that allows an autarkic nation to maintain internal equilibrium, the attacking power is attempting to force a transition from a functioning state to a failing one. However, this relies on a fundamental miscalculation regarding the nature of the modern Iranian economy. We are seeing a trend that should concern every market participant: the weaponization of the supply chain. If Iran and its proxies decide that the cost of defending these facilities is too high, they will not simply retreat. They will pivot. They will transition from protecting the oil flow to guaranteeing that if they cannot have access to it, no one else can either. The mathematics of this war is simple. When you destroy the production capabilities of a regime that is already sanctioned out of the global market, you are not destroying its economy. You are accelerating its transition into a wartime command structure. The strategy of the West assumes that internal economic collapse will inevitably lead to regime change. History, however, suggests the opposite. Extreme economic distress creates a siege mentality that empowers the most radical elements of the security state. When the private sector is erased, the military and the Revolutionary Guard become the sole providers of goods, services, and stability. By targeting these hubs, the West is inadvertently helping Tehran complete its transition to a fully closed, militarized economic circuit. This is the ultimate asymmetric card in the deck. It does not require a large navy. It requires only a few well-placed, low-cost assets to turn the Strait of Hormuz into a graveyard for global trade. We must look at the second-order effects on the global energy landscape. The global market is not a neutral, objective mechanism. It is a complex, hyper-fragile web of dependencies. When Iranian petrochemical exports are disrupted, the immediate result is not just a price hike. It is a supply-side shock that ripples through the manufacturing sectors of Europe and Southeast Asia. The shock is not the event. The shock is the realization that the global system cannot absorb a single point of failure. If the insurance markets in London, the nervous system of global logistics, withdraw coverage for the region, the ships stop moving, the tankers go dark, and the price of energy enters a phase of volatility that no central bank can stabilize. This is the hidden trap that policymakers in Washington refuse to acknowledge. You do not need to sink a carrier group to paralyze the global economy. You only need to make the risk of transit too high for the private sector to bear. The strategic community in the West remains fixated on the idea that this is a manageable escalation. They believe that if they apply enough pressure, the rational forces within the Iranian leadership will eventually sue for peace. This is a profound misunderstanding of the regime's internal evolution. The pragmatic actors who once believed in the possibility of a negotiated settlement have been methodically purged or sidelined. What remains is a hardline coalition that views this conflict not through the lens of economic benefit, but through the lens of historical mission. They have reached a point where the cost of existence is war, and therefore, war is the only rational state of being. We are entering a phase where military power is being decoupled from political outcome. The West has overwhelming firepower, but it has no clear political end state that is achievable through that firepower. It has the capacity to destroy, but not the capacity to govern. And in the absence of a governing strategy, destruction is not a tool of policy. It is a tool of chaos. This brings us to the ultimate uncomfortable truth of this era. The global system is no longer organized around the principles of economic efficiency or the open movement of goods. It is organizing itself around the principle of resilience at the expense of integration. As these events continue to unfold, we should expect more, not less, of this systemic friction. The era of a seamless global market is behind us. We are moving toward a world where regional powers consolidate their spheres of influence, and where the cost of doing business will be determined by the proximity to conflict zones. For the average individual, this means that the era of cheap, reliable access to the fruits of global trade is ending. You are paying for the insecurity of the Strait of Hormuz, in the price of your commute, the cost of your groceries, and the stability of your local economy. The distance between the conflict in the Middle East and your daily life is not geographic, it is economic, and that distance is shrinking every day. We are not watching the resolution of a conflict. We are watching the systematic dismantling of a global framework that was built on the assumption that it would last forever. It won't. And the final chapter of this history is already being written by those who recognize that the only true path to power in the next decade is not through winning the war, but through successfully surviving the collapse of the system that made the war possible in the first place. The trajectory is set. The only variable remaining is the degree of the friction that the rest of the world will be forced to absorb. And that is not a debate. That is a mathematical certainty. The American leadership, trapped in the survival calculus described previously, will continue to push, creating more instability, more systemic fragility, and eventually, a reality where the global order is just a memory. The Middle East is the epicenter of this collapse, but the shockwaves will reach every corner of the planet. And when the dust settles, when the smoke clears, and when the cost has become unbearable, the only question that will remain is whether we are prepared for the new, fragmented, and demanding reality that is rising from the ashes of the old. There are no easy choices here, only trade-offs, only consequences. Welcome to the new world.